I'm Sahil, a cloud support engineer here at the AWS office in Bangalore. Today, I'm going to show you how to troubleshoot issues when connecting to an Amazon API Gateway private API endpoint in an Amazon virtual private cloud. Let's get started.
Let's review some of the reasons due to which resources within Amazon VPC cannot access a private API endpoint. The API Gateway resource policy for the private API isn't configured correctly. First, log into the AWS Management Console. Open the API Gateway console. Select your private API. For this demonstration, let's say that we have a private API that's attached to the VPC endpoint for the execute API service. The endpoint is in the VPC demo VPC. We will try to access the private API endpoint from an Amazon Elastic Compute instance within the same VPC as of the VPC endpoint. Let's take a look into the errors caused by incorrectly configured API Gateway resource policy. If you have an incorrect resource policy to allow access to a private API for traffic from a particular VPC or interface VPC endpoint for the execute API, then the request to the API might return an error. Incorrect configurations include situations such as allowed VPC ID is different from the VPC ID where the request is generated. For example, the test VPC is allowed instead of the demo VPC from where the request is made. To resolve this issue, make sure that the API Gateway's resource policy is configured correctly to allow access to the API from either the desired VPC ID or the VPC endpoint ID. Let's modify the resource policy to allow invocations from my demo VPC that contains my EC2 instance. Make sure to redeploy the API to this stage once the resource policy is updated. Now, let's make a request to the private API endpoint from my Amazon EC2 instance. As we can see, the request returns with the desired response. The VPC endpoint policy isn't configured correctly. Now, let's look into the error that occurs when the VPC endpoints policy isn't configured correctly. Log into the AWS Management Console and go to the VPC console. Navigate to the Endpoints console. Select the already created VPC endpoint for the API Gateway. The Policy tab shows the VPC endpoint policy. Make sure that this policy allows the clients that's making the request to access the private API. The default is the full access policy. If the policy does not allow access to your client, then the request will return the error user anonymous is not authorized to perform execute API invoke on your resource. Let's go to the Amazon EC2 console to see exact error when there is a deny in the VPC endpoints policy. To resolve this issue, make sure that the VPC endpoints resource policy is configured correctly to allow access to the API gateway. Let's modify the VPC endpoint policy to allow invocation of execute API action. Now, let's make a request to the private API endpoint from Amazon EC2 instance. As we can see, the request returns the desired response. The rules for the VPC endpoint security groups aren't configured correctly. On the VPC endpoints console, you have security groups attached with the interface VPC endpoint. If the security group rules aren't configured correctly, then you'll get an error, connection timed out. Let's make a request to the private API from an Amazon EC2 instance. As you can see, the request times out with a connection timed out error. To resolve this issue, the security group for the Amazon EC2 instance must have a security group rule that allows TCP port 443 outbound traffic to the interface VPC endpoint's IP address range or security group. Let's take a look at the interface VPC endpoint security group that allows TCP port 443 inbound traffic from the IP address range or security group of the EC2 instance that's making the request. The security group looks correctly configured. Let's try to make a test request to the private API. As we can see, the request returns with the desired response. Now that we have looked over the required configurations to access a private API, let's talk about how to invoke a private API based on the private DNS setting. The invoke URL for the private API includes incorrect domain name system names. To invoke a private API, the invoke URL must be correctly formatted. The format depends on whether you have a private DNS turned on for the interface VPC endpoint. To check the private DNS setting on the VPC endpoint, first open the VPC endpoints console. Under the details, you will see the private DNS name enable set to either yes or no. If the private DNS names enabled is set to yes, then use the API gateway stage invoke URL to access the private API. As you can see, the request returns a 200 OK status code with the desired response. If you see that the private DNS name enabled is set to no, then use the endpoint specific public DNS host names to access the private APIs. Make sure that either the host or XAPI gateway ID header is passed with the request. As you can see, the request returns a 200 OK status code with the desired response. The private custom domain name isn't associated with the VPC endpoint. To invoke the private API using the custom domain name, the private custom domain name must be associated with your interface VPC endpoint. If the interface VPC endpoint isn't associated with the private API custom domain name, then you will see the error SSL no alternative certificate subject name matches the target host name for your custom domain name. To resolve this error, we must create domain name access association. Follow these steps. Go to your private custom domain name in the API Gateway console. Select the Resource Sharing tab and choose Create Domain Access Association. And then choose Create Domain Association. Select your interface VPC endpoint ID. Choose Create Domain Association. As we configured the domain name access association correctly, let's try to make a test request to the private API through the custom domain name. As we can see, it returns a 200 OK status code with the desired response. The resource policy for the private custom domain name isn't configured correctly. Now let's talk about how to invoke the private API based on the resource policy of the private API custom domain name. To invoke the private API with a custom domain name, we must allow the invocation of the private custom domain name in its resource policy. This policy is similar to the API Gateway Resource Policy, but we must configure it when we are using the private API custom domain name. By default, whenever you create a custom domain name, there is a deny effect in the resource policy of the custom domain name. Because of this deny effect, all the invocations that use the custom domain name fail with the error user anonymous is not authorized to perform execute API invoke action on the resource. To resolve this issue, we can add the following resource policy. This policy allows invoking the private API custom domain name from either the VPC endpoint or RVPC. For this demo, let's add a condition key that allows invoking the API only from the source VPC endpoint using the AWS source VPCE condition key. After we have configured the resource policy correctly, let's go back to the EC2 instance that's in the same VPC as of our VPC endpoint. Let's make a test request to the private API using the private custom domain names. As we can see, we get a 200 OK status code with the desired response. And now you know how to troubleshoot issues when connecting to an API Gateway private API endpoint in a VPC.
Thanks for watching and happy cloud computing from all of us here at AWS.